A visual IDE for React that lets you build and style components, where you can create boards to represent different states of your components. It integrates with TypeScript and Git. What would that even look like? What's up, everyone? My name is James Q. Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. And I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, which is Codex, a brand new visual IDE for React. Now, why would you be interested in a visual IDE for React? There's lots of different features. One of the things I want to call out is this is beneficial, I think, for people of different experience levels, but particularly for people that are beginners in the React space and maybe just JavaScript in general. And that's because Codex comes with visual tools to be able to create components, design components, style components, and test your components as well. So what does testing your components mean? Well, in this case, Codex provides boards where you can represent different states of your components to ensure that your components are rendering appropriately based on window size, props that are coming in, all different kinds of factors, again, to make sure they're rendering appropriately based on all those different conditions. Now, the really cool thing about this is that Codex doesn't replace your typical workflow inside of your editor. You can still work in whatever you typically write code in, which is VS Code for me. And then you can augment that by doing some of the visual pieces inside of Codex and go back to VS Code at any time. They even include jump links, which we'll see in the video, to take you directly to the appropriate code snippet inside of VS Code so you can go back and forth if you need and or want to. Now, as I said earlier, Codex integrates perfectly with TypeScript. You get IntelliSense around what the types are for expected props coming into a component. And in terms of styling, you can work with CSS, Sass, CSS modules, and eventually with Tailwind, which is my favorite way to do CSS as well. Now, as we move into the hands-on portion of this video, keep in mind this is free and you can download it and get started and follow along with the video and the link in the description below. That said, let's go ahead and dive in. All right, after you downloaded Codex, this is the home page that it's going to take you to, and I'm going to start with an interactive tutorial project. I'm going to give this the name of Tutorial Project 5. I've done this a few times now. And what this is going to do is actually clone a repository out there on GitHub and bring it down for me to reference and work with inside of VS Code and then inside of Codex. So after that has finished cloning, notice that it first pops up with a configuration script to run, which is the run install, basically your npm install. And this is a good indicator of basically this is following the exact same development workflow that we would have on a project anyway. We would clone the project, we would run install, and then we would run that project. So similar kind of idea here. Now, the other thing I want to show you is this actually pulls down the code locally so that I could reference this in VS Code. So here's what that looks like. All right, I've got this project open in VS Code. Notice there's a package.json with dependencies and scripts that we can run just like we're used to. There's also the codex config.json. This has a few different things configured in here. We'll cover a couple of those properties that help it integrate with Codex. But most importantly, inside of the source directory, we just have regular code. So we have our components, we have styles in here, we have global stuff, we have assets, and then there's also this underscore codex directory. This is where we can store data associated with the different boards to be able to do our testing of different states of our components. But what does this look like inside of Codex? Well, we have a list of all of our components over here. We can click on one of these components and see that it has one board associated with it. We can click into here and now get into the visual editor where we could come in and actually edit these things. So you can see we get a reference to all of the elements in here. We can click and select these. And then what's really cool is we have a couple of different things on the right that we can check out. One is the properties tab. We'll see this for properties coming into components in what we do in a second. You can see this has a default property of key. We can see that this is null, string, or number. So again, we have this TypeScript typing associated with these inputs. But then what's really cool is we have styling in here as well. And we have a selector style in .task. We can click on this selector and actually see the styles associated with that, which is really neat. So based on that class, we can actually see those styles. Now, not only can we see the code for this, we can also open this directly in VS Code. So this takes me back to VS Code, takes me directly to this definition of this task class. So again, for beginners to be able to see what classes are applied inside of a visual editor and then have links to take them directly to the code is actually a pretty cool feature of Codex. So that's a really quick, brief look around with an existing project inside of Codex. Now let's go ahead and add an existing React project in Codex from scratch so we can see how to design components and then even build them from scratch. All right, so the project that I'm working on, this demo, is basically a clone of the Learn, Build, Teach content page. So Learn, Build, Teach is the Discord community that I run. On the content page, we show recent content from the LBT community. So content that people in our community have created. So we have these cards with content that they've created. And I have a basic React application here that is kind of getting us started on this, but notice this obviously doesn't look near as good. We don't have the rounded corners on the cards. The titles are blue instead of white. We actually want to reorder some of these properties, etc. So we're going to go in and actually import this project into Codex and start from scratch to be able to make these changes and then create a nav bar that more or less matches the nav bar that we have here. So let's go into Codex and actually import this project. So inside of Codex from the homepage, we could create a new project where we could choose create React app, Webpack, Vite, etc. There's also some starter templates, but we're going to go in and open a local project. So I'm going to navigate to my local repository that I'm building this Learn, Build, Teach content page clone on. So I've called this React Codex demo. I'm going to go ahead and import this. And we start off by saying that there's no components found. So we need to actually tell this to scan our application for components. Now this is pretty neat because we don't have to do anything manual for this. It just goes out and finds all the different components that we have. You can see that this pretty much aligns with what we have in our dashboard as well. So we have the app as a whole. We have individual nav links, which we'll add to a brand new nav bar in a second. We have a share list, and then we have our share card. Now, as we look inside of these components, notice that none of these have any boards actually associated with them. So our boards are how we represent different states of our components to be able to test and make sure they're rendering appropriately. So inside of our share card, let's go ahead and add one here. So we'll add a share card. And then notice it kind of starts with an error in the window, which actually is a good thing, and I'll tell you why in a second. But this would be our visualizer, and this would be the code that represents the board that we're working on. So if we go back to VS Code, just to show you this, inside of here, it created a underscore Codex, and then we have our share card -1.board. So going back to this error that it's showing, it actually gives us a good idea of we're trying to render this share card, but inside of this code, inside of this component, it's expecting a property called share with these different properties. So what's interesting is if we look inside of the properties tab over here, or we start by selecting our share card and then look in properties tab, you can see that by default, it gets kind of a key value here and then also has a share property. So if I click on share property, I can edit the individual properties and notice that these individual properties line up with the TypeScript definition for that share. So if we come back to the code for our actual share card component, notice that it's defined an interface called share, and it expects that to be a prop that's passed in here. Now what's cool is Codex can automatically parse all of that and then give us this editor to be able to add all the different properties for that share that we want to. And you can see it even starts to render here, even though we haven't added all of the data. So one of the things that I'm going to do is paste in a snippet for an example share, and I'm going to pass that inside of here. So the same way we'd render this share card, we're calling share and then passing in the actual share. So now we can see that this is rendering things, and it's not exactly what we want, so we'll go in and style this in a minute. But you can see that we have an image, we have a title, we have by, and we have a date. And that is all coming from this example data here. Now, this share is actually imported from the share card, the actual interface. So I'm going to go ahead and import this from, and we'll have to go back a few levels into components and into, actually it's from this existing import. So this will be inside of share. So now we have our errors go away and we have our data represented or visualized, but now we want to go in and actually change this, the styling of it to match what we're looking for. So let's start to go into the share card and start to edit the stuff that is here. Now, one of the things we can do with our image is we can give this a height. So let's go click on our image. Let's go to our styles and let's go and apply a class to this. So inside of the image, we can see that we don't yet have a share image class. So let's go ahead and create this thing. And then it's going to ask us to create this inside of our share card.css. All right, so that has created for us. If we look at this, it can actually take us directly to this inside of VS Code again. And here's our new share image class that it created in the correct component. So with this share image class, we can now go and style this thing, and we can come down specifically to the width and height. And I'm going to say that I want this to be not 100 pixels, but 100%. So I want to take the full width. And then I want to set the height to 200 pixels. Now notice this is looking a little odd. it's getting kind of stretched out. So one of the things that I could do going back to VS Code if I wanted to, so let's go hit this button and go back to VS Code. If I wanted to change any CSS properties outside of the visual editor back inside of here, I can do this. So I'm going to come in here and add object fit of cover. This should make it look a little less stretched out. All right, so notice that it keeps the same ratios, but it's filling the available space that we want it to take up. So that's looking a lot better. Now let's move into the actual content of this card. So inside of this div, I'm going to add a class of share content, and we'll go ahead and create this class inside of the share card component again. So there that is. And the big thing we want to do inside of here is just add some padding. So we can add 20 pixels all the way around, maybe 10 pixels, give it a little bit less. So notice that I had the lock on, so it's going to apply to all of these different ones. If I update this to 11, if I disable the lock, you can obviously control individual padding for top, left, right, and bottom. All right, so we have our padding, and now we can start to work with the title. Now this is obviously a blue color, which we don't want it to be. It's underlined, which we don't want it to be. Maybe want to change the font family to a sans serif, etc. So let's click on this element, and then we can come over to classes, and we'll add a share title class. So we'll go ahead and create this class inside of the share card CSS. And then let's come down and do a couple of basic things. So inside of font family, let's set this to a sans serif. I would probably put this as a global style, but in this case, we'll just add it here. And then we can come in and set the color as well. Now, because this is an anchor tag, by default, it's kind of applying this underline. So this is actually a text decoration, and you may not want to scroll to find all the different things that you're looking for. So we can actually search for text decoration in here, apply the underline, and then get rid of it. So now that title is looking a lot better. Now, one of the things is I want to use the sans serif on all of these fonts. I'm actually going to go back to the share content, get rid of this search, and then come back to the font family and just apply this to everything inside of it. So that's starting to look a little bit better. Now, one thing I want to do though is actually reorder these to put this p tag above the title. So what's cool inside of here is I can actually drag and drop this to move this on top of the title, which is actually starting to look a little bit better. So inside of this visual editor, you can drag and drop over here as well as drag and drop over here as well. So you really get the visual editor builder experience in addition to the styles that you're working on. Now let's go back to our share card, and actually let's check out a little bit of our logic in here. So we have a default image property. So if we pass a share to this component that doesn't include an image URL, we want it to display this default image. So we can actually test this by representing different states of our component with another board. So let's go back home. We're on our share card here. Let's create a new component, or excuse me, a new board. So let's do a new board for this, and we'll call this share card with default image. All right, let's go ahead and create that. And then let's import the share in here. So the share model, I'm going to paste in that snippet that we had before. So here's our example share, and let's pass that into the share property. But what I want to do now is actually get rid of this image URL. And what we should be seeing is that it displays the default image. So this is now two different components that we have, or two different boards to represent this component based on different state. One where it includes the image URL and one where it has the default image. So I can say that this is appropriately responding to the input based on whether or not that image URL is included. Now, if you've ever used something like Storyblock, this is probably really familiar for you, where you're creating these different boards to represent and test these different states. So it's really cool to have this integrated into Codex. All right, so we've worked with a few different components and we've created a couple of different boards. Let's actually create a component from scratch, and we're going to create a navbar component. So we're going to call this navbar. We'll call a board navbar, and then we'll give it an empty template. We can come down to advanced. There's a few different things we could do to configure this, but it's going to go ahead and generate some code for us. So just to show you inside of VS Code what this looks like, it created inside of our boards, it created our first navbar board. And then inside of components, it created a directory called navbar. So here's our navbar, which there's not a whole lot in there yet. So let's go into our navbar and let's start to edit this component. And let's add a nav tag as a wrapper. So we can start to add components in here by just dragging and dropping this stuff around. Now inside of here, I want to have two different things. I want to have a piece of text on the left, and then I want to have nav items spread out all the way on the right. So we're going to use Flexbox to do that. So let's go ahead and start to lay this out. The first thing I want to have is typography. We'll just have a basic paragraph, and I'm just going to drag this inside of here. And this title is going to be, let's edit this over here. It's going to be Learn, Build, Teach. All right. And we can style this the same way we've been doing other things. Let's go and grab the paragraph tag. We'll add a nav title. And then it's asking us, do you want us to create a CSS file associated with this nav bar? Absolutely. Good to know. And then we'll come down and do a few basic things with this. So font family, again, is going to be a sans serif. We will have a font size of maybe 18 pixels. Make this a little bit bigger, maybe 22, even bigger, maybe 24, not 223. And then we could do any number of things, but that'll work for now. So we want to have our Learn, Build, Teach, and then we want to have, outside of the nav title, we want to have another div. So let's add in here. Let's do a div block. Let's drag this in. And then inside of our div block, this is where it gets interesting. We want to have not just built-in elements, but we want to actually reference local components. So we already have a nav link component. So I can drag this in underneath this div, and now we've got a nav link added in here as well. Now, similar to what we had before, it's missing the link and the text properties. So I'm going to add in some dummy data in here. So we'll add the link, and I'm just going to put this to my website. So the website. And then on this nav bar, let's go and look at what this looks like in the browser. So at the top on the real website, we have home, content, and code of contact, or code of conduct, for example. So let's go in here, and actually this should be the Learn, Build, Teach home. So let's do this, and that'll be our link, and then our text will be home. All right, so that is one, and then we can duplicate this. Let's duplicate this, and now we'll say content, and then we'll duplicate another component, and then we'll have code of conduct. So that's our basic unstyled nav bar. Now we want to actually start to style this thing. So up at the nav, we want to actually give this a class to start. So we'll give this a class of nav bar. We'll create that class in the nav bar CSS. We can now use Flexbox, and I think this is like really, really cool. So Flexbox is this button over here. We say Flexbox, and notice it's already starting to align these things to line them up horizontally. Now, one of the things I can do is kind of change this viewport a little bit to be a little bigger because I want to spread these things out, which we'll see in a second. So with our nav bar, with it being Flexbox, two things I want to do is I want to align items center. So notice this centers them vertically, which is great. And then for the justify content, I want to put space in between these. So this is space between. Now it's starting to align these the way that I want. So that's great. Now the other thing I want to do is start to style these nav links. So with this nav link selected, I can click edit, and then we'll grab this and we'll apply a class of nav link. Go ahead and create that class inside of our nav link CSS. This is new. So because it's associated with that nav link component. All right, and now we can start to style these. So we may want to do a few different things. Another thing, we'll do this again, or it may have already been applied. We'll just make sure this is a sans serif. We can also give this a font size. We can say maybe these are 18 pixels. We can get rid of the underline under text decoration. So we'll get rid of that. Now we actually want the color of all of these to be white, and you'll see we'll have a little bit of issue with this. We actually want this title text to be the same. So let's go back and do that as well. So we'll add the color of white to all of these. And the thing we're missing is we want to make sure that we are setting the nav bar, setting its background color to the blue that we're used to. So we'll come in and add a color in here, and there it is. So a couple of things, we're obviously missing some padding. So let's search for padding with our nav bar. So let's add 10 pixels all the way around. That looks good. And then lastly, for the container of our nav links, we want to add a class to this so we can style it as well. So we'll title this nav links. Go ahead and create that class in our nav bar CSS. And then what we want to do is we can add padding around each of its elements. The one thing I like to do is to set this to Flexbox and then use something called gap. So on the x-axis on the row, we're going to set 10 pixels in between each of these. So 10 pixels, something like that. And that's now maybe 20 is a little bit better. But using grid gap, we're able to automatically apply spacing between these elements. So that is looking really good inside of here. Now with our nav items, there's some more styling that we can add, and that comes with hover states. So one of the things that we can do is activate a hover state in here. If we come into states and click hover, then it actually gives us the option to create a class for our hover. So now we can create a selector. And maybe we can come into our text and just add like a text shadow. So if we add a shadow on here and give it a color of white, and then maybe increase the blur a lot. So see, we can kind of get that like little blurred hover effect back there. So when we start to blur this out, so we can add this little effect, and notice it's showing this one because we've got the activated state set. So we can actually get rid of that and then come into preview mode. And here we can actually interact with this as if it is a real website. So we can see that the hover effect is actually taking place. So a really neat way to work on the hover styling and other pseudo selectors that you can add and test right inside of here. All right, so we've got an additional check that we can do with our share list. Let's go ahead and create a component for share list. This will be, or actually, sorry, not the component, but the share, the board. So we'll say share board with data, and you'll see why in a second. So I want to basically copy in examples of share. So I'm going to copy in the snippet that we've used before. So we'll pass in one share in here. So we'll pass into our share list. We'll pass in a property of shares. And then inside of here, this will be an array. And then inside of that array, we'll pass in the share that we just created. We can also come and do our import again as well for that data type. So we'll come in, import share from the share card component. And this is rendering, if we get rid of our typos, this is rendering correctly, which is great. And we could come in and kind of replicate this with share and share and share. And this will just kind of show that our grid is working the way we expect, where it's going to have 3 different shares based on the way we defined our grid. Now, the one thing we want to know, though, is how does this actually work when we don't pass in, or we pass in an empty array? So let's come back to this one and let's create another board, and we'll say share list empty array. Again, testing these different test cases for our rendering. And then inside of here, we'll just pass an object, which is an empty array. And so what we want to see, this should be shares. What we want to see is that this actually shows this piece of text here. Now, what's really cool is when we come in and kind of look at this component inside of here, it shows us this if condition. And I'm going to take you to the code really quickly so you can see this. So we're doing this conditional rendering based on the shares property. So if the length of the array is 0, then we output a piece of text that says there are no shares. Otherwise, if the length is greater than 0, then we go ahead and actually map through each one of these. So what's cool about this is you can actually see those 2 different options here, and it shows you which one is being used. So if you kind of maybe zoom in with your eyes, I'll zoom in so you can see it. The share card is grayed out versus this p tag is not grayed out because this is the one that's actually being conditionally rendered. So I think that's really cool. It shows you in here that this is a condition, and then this is a repeater that we're not using yet. But if we go back to share list with data and come in to edit, you can see this has the repeater and then shows here are the different elements inside of that repeater, which in this case with React is basically using an array.map function to render these different components appropriately. So not only do you have the ability to visualize and view your design, you also have the ability to kind of see some of the logic going on here and understand why things are rendering the way that they are based on seeing these repeaters and expressions and logic right inside of Codex as well. Now, the last thing I want to show you is if we go back into VS Code and we initialize this as a Git repository. So we'll initialize this as a Git repository. Then we'll have the ability to work with Git inside of our code. So notice up here, it says the main branch. If we look into the Git tab, we can expand this and make it a little bit bigger. Notice this looks really familiar to the experience that you would have inside of VS Code, where you can view the files, the changes, make commits, etc. So with all of these files selected, we can say initial commit and go ahead and commit all 30 of these files. And now it says there's no other changes. If I came in and updated some piece of code inside of the share list, like I updated this text here, notice it shows me that that file has changes. I could say updated something, go ahead and commit this as well. So you have these, the like Git integration right inside of here. You could push this to your centralized repository inside of GitHub or wherever you have your code stored. So it's pretty neatly integrated with your already existing development workflow, where you can still use VS Code if you want to. You can use the visual editor if you want to. You can jump back and forth using the jump links from Codex into VS Code, which is pretty neat. Inside of Codex, you can create different boards for your components that represent different states of your components to make sure that they're rendering for all these different test cases like width and properties that are passed in or not, optional properties, for example. So this is really a powerful tool, especially I think for a beginner React developer to kind of understand where all the different pieces are and how to learn more about an existing code base or just creating a new one. So I'm curious, what do you think about Codex as a visual IDE? Is this something you're interested in trying out? Remember, there's a link in the description below so that you can do that for free today. But let me know what you think and if you have any feedback so that they can continue to make this product better. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time.